privacy in the world.
And I've gotten, we're out of time. I just don't have any more time to go. I've got other distinguished colleagues in my department that I want to participate. I don't want to erode their time. They're down to a very short time schedule. I'm going to leave this one question up here. Perhaps they can work it into their program. And I thank you very much, all of you, for your time and attention. And I will turn it over to the next panelist and moderator. And
3 minutes.
We'll continue.
We're going to have a 3-minute break for the next panel. We're really running over time.
Dr. Muhammad Al-Massari to my left, Dr. Dierdorf and Dr. Octa to my right, and is Mr. Abdul Maboud Dirdiri in the building, in the room? Where is Abdul Maboud? I want you all to know that we have one of the parliament members of the Muhammad Morsi government. You might call it the dissolved parliament. He is in the building, a very special guest. I think they must get him into this room as quick as possible. I apologize to you also. Some of you had to get on the road. We're kind of running overtime, but we really appreciate you coming. I just spoke to someone from way out of state, and it's really good to have such a wide variety of people that care about this topic. Osama, are we going to do that short video, the cartoon one? I think this is a very interesting piece he's going to show now. It's a kind of sarcastic cartoon about this coup d'etat that happened in Egypt. What would happen if it happened in America? Here it is.
Good morning. It's Monday, September 30th, and we bring you this special update. Millions of anti-Obama protesters have taken to the streets to demand that President Obama step down as president. Filmmaker Kerry has been monitoring the situation from a military helicopter.
Can you turn the volume up?
Claims put the actual number at over 100 million. No more Mr. Popular. As of this morning, President Obama's rankings have plummeted to below 38%. Will keep you posted as events unfold.
Any crowds now, bro?
Where are you taking him?
We'll be taking him to a special place. Lights out, baby. Push out!
Today, tens of millions of Tea Party protesters took to the streets. They cheered on police motorcycles and military Humvees that passed through the streets as soldiers threw chocolates and candies at the crowd. Looked like a scene out of a bad comic book. What's that? In breaking news, CNN reports a possible military coup. President Obama said to be missing after his Secret Service detail was overcome by uniformed guards. We will keep you informed on this troubling news as it breaks.
Good evening, America. Our democracy is under attack. Senate Leader Harry Reid and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi were apprehended by members of the U.S. Capitol Police late this afternoon, who later handcuffed them and put them in a car headed for an undisclosed location. The nation is on fire. Right-wing, anti-Obama protesters have dispersed, but millions of peaceful pro-Obama demonstrators are in the streets at this hour calling on the NSA to respect the democratic process and return President Obama to his rightful role as leader of the free world. Army tanks have joined the police force. We turn now for more to combat reporter Richard Engel on the ground in Washington, D.C. Richard, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here, Rachel, but it's hard to hear because it's dead. As you can see, things are starting to spin out of control. The army's out on the streets beating back the peaceful demonstrators and shooting at men and women indiscriminately. Goodbye, Posse Comitatus.
Richard, looks like we lost him. What's that? CNN is just now reporting that current TV has just gone off the air in a hostile takeover? Hello? Hello? Wait! What's going on? You can't do this!
We urge you to remain calm. The United States government has announced a curfew while the army keeps you safe from a legal pro-democracy movement who are armed and dangerous. Stay in your homes. There is no need to panic. The army has appointed a president, and we will have a new U.S. Constitution in place. By January, to keep legitimate U.S. citizens safe and secure. This message of peace has been brought to you by the United States Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Agency.
Only 5 countries cheered on the American military coup, including United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. What do you call this? Yes, a brutal military coup and a democratic nightmare. Why call it anything different when it takes place in Egypt? Wake up, human race. It's time to respect every vote. Support Egypt support democracy.
Ooh, man, let me tell you. I want to read a little statement here if you want to know what, how these governments get an excuse to round up who they call terrorists and all that. Well, these backstabbers, otherwise known as the royal family of Saudi Arabia, who used to be pretty friendly with the Egyptian people, and then when the military coup, you see, came in next door in Egypt, they supported the military coup because they, as monarchs, and you know, these are really not countries, they're kind of oil wells with a flag hanging off of them. They knew that their own population would respond if they saw a progressive, forward-moving, free people of Egypt doing things. So what happened was that King Abdullah, the gentleman who is the king of Saudi Arabia, this old man, about 90 years old, he has one foot in the grave and the other one on a banana peel. He followed suit after Sisi described the Brotherhood as terrorists, any dissident as a terrorist, anybody carrying the four fingers of Rabah as a terrorist. Then King Abdullah at American Pushing, he said on February 4th, just a couple months ago, he said, a royal decree announcing that belonging to intellectual or religious trends or groups that are extremist or categorized as terrorist at the local, regional, or international level, as well supporting them or showing sympathy for their ideas and methods in whichever way, or expressing support for them through whichever means, or offering them financial or moral support, or inciting others to do any of this or promoting any such actions in word or writing will be punished by a prison sentence of no less than 3 years and no more than 20 years. This effectively does the work of banning the Muslim Brotherhood also inside Saudi Arabia and its sphere of influence. This is the kind of thing that we're dealing with, and so this cartoon you just saw is just a sarcastic kind of slap in the face to as if this would happen in America. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very distinguished panel, and I'm going to have to ask them, and I'm embarrassed to do so because of the time. I'm going to ask them to take their speeches and condense them into, 8 to 10 minutes where they can make their main points maybe in the form of bullet points instead of, reading all the paragraphs, just to make these bullet points as to the important items that they want to emphasize. To my right, we have Dr. Muhammad Al-Massari from the University of Denver. He has a very long list of accolades that were written down, but in general, he's a professor of media science, and he can explain better than I. Dr. Octa, I'm sorry to take this extra time, but we do want to give them a proper introduction because we have so many talented people on the stage here. Dr. Jessica Octa is the assistant professor of political science at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, right here. She teaches courses in international politics, including genocide and humanitarian intervention and American foreign policy. PhD from Arizona State University. This is an important presentation she's going to make. And to her right, you have Dr. Michelle Dierdorf, another professor of political science here, and coming to Chattanooga after previously teaching at Jackson State University in Mississippi, as well as Millikan University in Illinois. Constitutional law, political philosophy, these are items that are high on her agenda. Dr. Dierdorf is a founding member of the Fannie Lou Hamer National Institute on Citizenship and Democracy. She has a whole lot of things to bring to the table. We're talking Fannie Lou Hamer, okay? Last but not least, on the extreme, my right, this gentleman, Abdul Mawgood Dirdari, is actually a parliament member of Egypt who was who was kicked off the parliament by the military coup. He's a very special man who I just met barely 20 hours ago, but I see that he's a brilliant thinker, a very clear thinker, a man of justice and integrity that stands up for what I remember Dr. Morsi, when he had his inauguration speech after he won the election, he said something that this man, Abdul Mawgood, reflects. That Muhammad Morsi said something that really impressed me at his inauguration speech. He said, if we Egyptian people become free and accomplish our goals and be able to express ourselves on a large level, we're not going to just be a regional presence. Indeed, Egypt, with 83 million people that are so well-educated, that the Egypt, the most important and largest Arab and Islamic country in that area, the most history, the most, you see, treasures, the most global history. We want to be a power for the world, for the good for the world, starting with wiping out every hunger in Africa. Imagine, no hungry child in all of Africa. These are some of the basic goals that a healthy, forward-moving Egypt can accomplish. And so when he said that, I said, my goodness, this is bigger than I thought it was going to be. So this is a very important point I'd like to make, and I want to shut up at this point and bring up Dr. Muhammad Al-Massari. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief because I know that we're running a little bit behind on time. But if you think about the presentations that have been given today, many of the presentations have documented human rights abuses. And actually what's interesting and in some ways tragic is that these human rights abuses that we're describing have actually been justified and celebrated in the Egyptian media. If you look at August 14th, I just finished a fairly comprehensive analysis of Egyptian news coverage of the August 14th massacre. And I can only describe the tone as celebratory. The military and the security forces were praised, and the Egyptian people were congratulated on the dispersals of the protests. So, how is it that a large population like Egypt, and to be certain, Egypt is a split society right now. That's what the opinion polling data suggests. Okay, it's a deeply split society. But there are a lot of people that support Sisi and support the military government. There's no denying that. Okay, they do have support. How is it that so many people can come to support, justify, and even celebrate what any fair analysis would conclude is mass repression? I think media play a key role, and I've been very interested in examining the role of Egyptian media in the lead-up to the June 30th protests, and then also in the aftermath of the military coup. And I just want to briefly set the context for you. There's been a lot of research done, academic research, about the Egyptian news system. And the research suggests that there's a crisis of professionalism in the Egyptian news system. There's a lack of professionalism. If you look at all of the standard measures, education, training, they're very poor quality. If you look at journalistic ideology, notions of objectivity, balance, fairness, detachment, these things are largely absent. One of the professors from the AUC, a retired professor from the American University in Cairo, where I worked up until January, he did some research and did some interviews with journalists there, and they told him that they perceived themselves as activists, not as watchdogs. That's very, very dangerous in a politicized environment where Egypt needs debate. In research that I did last summer in Egypt, I also carried out some interviews with journalists at privately owned newspapers. And those journalists told me and my research team that they intentionally biased news reports to make the Muslim Brotherhood and President Morsi look bad. And they said that the editors at their newspapers taught them how to basically suppress anything that might appear to be good news about the economy or the government or anything else, and how to make Morsi look bad by highlighting and exaggerating anything that was negative. And to be certain, and I want to be clear about this, I think in my analysis, I think President Morsi made some mistakes, and I think some of them were fairly serious mistakes. So there was grounds to criticize him, but when it came time to be critical, the criticisms were grossly exaggerated. And what I've argued in my research is that a series of myths were propagated by the Egyptian media system about President Morsi and about the Muslim Brotherhood. I'd like to just give some examples of kind of some sub-discourses right now, and then talk about some more serious myths. If you look at news coverage during the Morsi period, again, this is that 1 year period in which Dr. Mohamed Morsi was president of Egypt, we have news stories, and I'm not talking about individual reports, I'm talking about stories. These are ongoing stories in serious, credible news outlets about Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood selling the Suez Canal. We had news stories about Morsi and the Brotherhood selling the pyramids. We had news stories about the Muslim Brotherhood seeking to destroy the pyramids. We had news stories about the Islamists, including the Muslim Brotherhood, seeking to make lower the marriage age to 9 years old. These are serious news reports. By the way, in case you were wondering, all of the examples that I've mentioned so far, and I've done research on this, they're all baseless. They have no basis. But people took these things very seriously. In fact, I won't mention the university, but I was at a meeting, a high-level meeting at a university in Egypt, and professors were sitting around talking about the disaster of 9-year-old girls getting married. And so this was taken quite seriously. They said, we have to do something to stop this. There were news stories about President Morsi's son being paid 30,000 Egyptian pounds per month. There were news stories about Morsi appointing 12,000 Muslim Brotherhood members to positions in the government. News stories about Morsi being an agent of Israel, and so on and so forth. These were serious news stories. They were ongoing in the press, and I believe, and I've argued, that they contributed to the public anger that we saw in the streets on June 30th. The most serious myths, I think there were several, but I think the most serious myths were two, about Morsi and about the Muslim Brotherhood. The first myth was that Morsi and the Brotherhood were seeking to brotherhoodize Egypt. They were, in Arabic it was called the brotherhoodization of the state. This story really took on a life of its own. If you go back to that 12-month period and look at the news stories, you find both in the print journalism and also the broadcast journalism, this is what we see. The Brotherhood was taking over the military, they were taking over the judiciary, they were taking over the police. Remember, a year ago, the news stories were saying that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, that Muhammad Ibrahim, the Wazir al-Dakhiliya, the Minister of Interior, was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. The people that carried out the coup were being accused of being, really actually the Brotherhood, Morsi was being accused of appointing secret Brotherhood members to these positions. The media was being Brotherhoodized. The government was being Brotherhoodized. I tried to challenge some people on this assumption because I don't think that the evidence really supports this conclusion, which is why I call it a myth. And so I was in a discussion with an academic in Egypt, and I said, what's the problem? Why are you motivated to go out into the streets on June 30th? This is prior to June 30th. And he said, he listed that myth. He said, because Morsi is brotherhoodizing Egypt. And I said, okay, well, what's your evidence? I'd like to hear your evidence for that position. And he said, and then he went through the kind of the litany, and I basically responded to him. And finally he said, well, he's brotherhoodizing the government. And I said, well, only about 30% of the ministers and governors are from the Brotherhood, right? Which is hardly an absurd number for the group that won 5 straight elections and really didn't have anything to work with, because, and this is an important point, there was a camp inside the liberal opposition to the Brotherhood that systematically rejected participation in government. And this is simply a fact. It goes back to June of 2012 when Morsi was elected, before he was elected president. Oh God, 2 minutes. That's not good. Are you sure there's not a 0? So I said only 30% are Brotherhood figures. And he said he had to backtrack, because I think he believed me. He could sense that I'd actually done research on this. And he said, no, that's not the problem. The problem is that the 4 key ministries have been brotherhoodized. And I said, what are the 4 key ministries? And he listed them. And I said, well, actually 3 of the 4 have non-brotherhood figures holding those posts. And he said, yes, that's the problem. It's that one ministry that has the brotherhood. This is a serious conversation. I'm not making it up. This is with an academic in Egypt. I won't mention his name or which university he works for. The other major myth, and again, I say this as somebody who, I think President Morsi could have done a lot of things better. I actually believe that he could have averted this crisis. Okay? But there was another myth, which was that he was completely and utterly incompetent, that he had no idea what he was doing, and that the country was being ruined. This is arguably the most prominent narrative that we find in that 12-month period. He was ruining the economy. Everything he touched just broke. It was called the Nas, the curse of Egypt. Morsi was called the curse of Egypt, right? If you go through and you look at the empirical facts, what you find is a flawed president who did some things well. He actually did some things well. He made some mistakes. Some of the mistakes I would characterize as fairly serious, but some of them were actually mistakes that anyone probably would have made under the circumstances, because the conditions were so difficult in Egypt, right? And this is why Professor Richard Falk of Princeton says the incompetence thesis is deeply problematic because the conditions were so difficult. I don't have time to unpack that. I wish I did. But if you look at, just really briefly, the last thing I'll say is post-July 3rd, the media coverage in Egypt has actually gotten significantly worse. It's actually gotten worse. So the Brotherhood on July 3rd became a treasonous group. They became a terrorist group. And the analysis that I've done, I watched 15 hours of news coverage, prominent news coverage, July 3rd, July 26th, and August 14th. The Brotherhood was being called a terrorist group on July 3rd. They were being called treasonous, khawana, on July 3rd, right? They were being described as disloyal to Egypt. They didn't respect Egypt's national borders. This is where you get people really justifying the mass repression. Well, they're not really Egyptians. They don't really have loyalty to our national border. The Brotherhood has been blamed for all of the violence that has occurred in the last several months. There's no denying that there have been bombings. There have been terrorist attacks in Egypt. There were churches attacked. But there's not a single piece of evidence linking the Brotherhood to this violence. The Brotherhood has denounced the violence, in strong terms in fact. I've looked at the discourse. They've called the church attacks crimes against not only Christianity, but crimes against Islam. Okay? Other groups have claimed responsibility, as Joe Stork pointed out, for most of the violence, yet it's the Brotherhood that is blamed most of the time without even any investigation taking place. So, believe me, I had much more to share with you. 4 pages, I'm only through a page and a half. But maybe in the Q&A, I'll have a chance to go into a little bit more detail. Thank you.
Well, we have a Q&A right now for you, Brother Dr. Muhammad Al-Massari. And of course, you said there are many Egyptians, and these are our brothers and associates and fellow citizens who don't agree with the victory of the Morsi government, who support the military coup. And they are our people as well. And there are thousands and millions of them. We have a question on that side of the scale, and we talked about how 7,000 years of Egyptian history, finally you have a free and open election, but here's the question. How democratic was the Morsi regime? Our media did not present it as democratic. I mean, how are you going to respond to that?
Well, I like to look at democratic measures. The Brotherhood supported the 2012 Constitution. I don't think that was a perfect document. But did it provide a basic democratic framework? I would say absolutely it did. If you look at that document, you have, and remember this is something that the Brotherhood openly campaigned for, and they helped write. Term limits for the president, which is it doesn't sound like a big deal in America, but that is a big deal in Egypt and in the Arab region. Term limits for the president. Significantly reduced presidential powers. The Brotherhood advocated for a a president that would not be as powerful. Just to give you one example, in the Mubarak days, Mubarak used to wield power through the emergency law. For 30 years, Mubarak put Egypt under a state of emergency. In the 2012 Constitution, in order for the president to declare a state of emergency, he had to get 2/3 approval from both the upper house of parliament and the lower house of parliament, and it could only be instituted for a period of 6 months, and it could only be renewed at a maximum of 1 time, only with public referendum, a national referendum. So those are very strict conditions. That's just one of many examples. I'll keep going. The prime minister in that 2012 document, that constitution, was actually, according to constitutional law scholars, more powerful than the president. So you have a balance of powers. Every Egyptian had the right to establish a political party. Every Egyptian had the right to join a political party. So you have political pluralism and competition. These are the things that I, as a political scientist or studying political scientist, these were the things that I was looking for. I didn't think it was a perfect document, but it provided the basic framework for democracy. As a media person, I was pleased to read in that document that every Egyptian had the right to own a newspaper without government approval. In the Mubarak days, you had to get approval from the government. In the 2012 Constitution, you only need to notify the government. So I would say that the Muslim Brotherhood, while flawed politicians, are democratic politicians.
Thank you. And while our government was deciding to call the coup something other than a coup, and deciding whether that military aid would continue to go, our friends in the royal family of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait all put their hands together. Brother Hamid, how much? 13 billion, 10 billion, whatever. While we were thinking about, should we give them the 1.3 billion, they said, take away the decimal point, make it 13 billion. They gave to the Sisi regime. So these are the kind of corrupt governments that our tax dollars don't support over there, right? So we can keep our gas at under $3 or whatever. And look at our gas. When the price of the barrel of oil goes up like $1, you divide that by 40 gallons. That's only like 4 cents a gallon. Why it goes up 15, 20 cents every week if it's 4 cents? You know what I mean? So there's a lot of games being played right on us right here. We are supposed to be the beacon of democracy in the world. We need to slap a few people around here too. The name of the organization, Egyptians Abroad for Democracy Worldwide, has a Facebook page, and these speeches that you're hearing today, I believe they'll be on that site, because we're getting 3 requests since Dr. Muhammad Al-Massari, and now we have 2 doctors from the UTC, not to mention the parliament member from Egypt. These are, I mean, how can I ask these people to speak for 7 minutes? Come on. We're going to be here till 11 o'clock tonight. But Jay Leno left, so it's okay. So I would like to move on right now to Dr. Jessica Octa, like I mentioned before, Political Science Department here at UTC. We'll ask her once again in a polite way to make those bullet points and make her points, and hopefully take some Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been really interesting to hear all of the previous presenters and the discussion that's emerged from that. My talk, I guess, that I want to give actually speaks quite nicely to some of the issues that were just brought up. I want to talk a little bit about U.S. foreign policy and some of the questions that have arisen as a result of that, why we've seen the policies that we have seen, what kind of policies we might see in the immediate future as a result of some specific events that have already been mentioned, and then going off of the questions that were asked of the previous set of panelists, what kind of things individual Americans might be able to do to sort of pressure change, and how we might see that kind of change to U.S. policy emerge. The first, I guess, my first bullet point that I want to address is just what U.S. foreign policy is usually based on. I think we tend to think of U.S. foreign policy as privileging things like democratization and human rights, because that's the rhetoric that it's often couched in. But this is not usually the case. If you look at the way that foreign policy proceeds, it might not be a surprise to many of you, but there are often these sort of impetuses of stability and democracy that are in tension with one another, and typically the U.S. has almost always privileged stability over pursuit of democracy or protection of human rights. and I think that has really come into play in the Egypt context. So this is often called a realpolitik approach to foreign policy, just the privileging of self-interest, or in this case, strategic interest. So U.S. policy has been and likely will be centered in the future on how the U.S. defines its own strategic interests. One of the things that I'll mention at the end if I have time is things that individual Americans can do to get the U.S. or individual U.S. policymakers to redefine this concept of strategic interest. Because if we're functioning according to strategic interests, then changing how we understand our strategic interests might change what U.S. policy towards Egypt actually is based off of. I think that the desire for stability, though, has long underpinned a U.S. relationship with Egypt. It has underpinned the U.S.'s relationship with Mubarak in the past, and I think that it also explains why the U.S. has not come out with firmer statements than it did, which weren't really that firm last summer when the military coup happened. I remember when I heard about the military coup, it was over that U.S. Independence Day holiday. I was with family. I received a notification on my smartphone about the coup, and I remember being shocked and going around telling all of my extended family that there had just been a military coup in Egypt, and no one really cared or knew what was going on. And I think that sort of typifies the kind of response that we saw in the U.S. at that point in time, and I think the desire to sort of maintain some kind of stability, and also U.S. perceptions of the Egyptian military colored our lack of significant response to the coup and our refusal to refer to it as a coup. So at the time, in the U.S., the way that the Arab Spring protest emerged as a whole in the context of Egypt was that the military was protecting the interests of the Egyptian people. This is something that was circulated in the media. So the average American's knowledge of Egypt, if they did have it, was centered around this notion that the military was protecting the Egyptian people. And I think to some degree that colored individual Americans' responses to this military coup then. If the military stepped in, it must have been something to do with protecting the people. And we've seen that rhetoric repeated again and again in the rhetoric of policymakers. It's something that John Kerry has said repeatedly. So I think that was the first obstacle to Americans and American policymakers calling it a coup. That their perception of the military was so strong. Their relationship with the military was obviously quite strong as well historically, but their perception of the military's involvement in the original protests, that colored their perception then of this military coup. So there was a difficulty in understanding that the military perhaps was not acting in the interest of the people, or that the situation was a bit more complicated than it was being portrayed. So by the time this information emerges about the crackdown that's going on and the extensive human rights violations that the other panelists have already talked about, so I won't rehash, I think U.S. foreign policy was already sort of path-dependent, was already privileging stability, and was defining that stability and interest as a relationship with the military, and using rhetoric of popular support to justify that they believed that the military had the support of the Egyptian people, whether or not that was actually the case. So I guess in the couple minutes that I have left, I have a couple minutes at least? Okay. I wanted to address some of the examples that have been brought up previously, particularly about the death sentences that were recently issued to the 529 people as part of this sham trial, and kind of use that to pose some questions about giving U.S. aid that was already brought up by the previous panelists. The U.S. response to the death sentences that were handed down a couple of weeks ago has been, I would say, a little bit lukewarm. Both John Kerry and the State Department spokespersons have used the language of defying logic. The sentences defy logic. They've noted how shocked they were about the death sentences that have been handed down, and that they don't believe that the trials were in accordance with international norms or international law, which is sort of obvious when you have, as was stated earlier, 529 people sentenced in such a short period of time for the death of one police officer. So I think we can all agree that it defies logic. But at the same time, these sort of questions about how the U.S. then would respond to that, and I think that they have decided to respond by exerting pressure on the current government rather than to change this sort of due process and focusing on questions of due process rather than focusing on this as one instance within a wider schema of more human rights violations. So they're focusing on the trials and the death sentences as one isolated event and using that to try to pressure the current Egyptian government to change the way that they conduct trials rather than viewing this widespread death sentence as symptomatic of the larger problem of widespread human rights violations that, as I said, everyone else has already documented. And the individuals who have directly suffered from these human rights violations are much better than I am at being able to describe how they're proceeding, so I won't even try to do that. But one thing I do want to point out is that I in particular and other human rights groups are especially concerned about is the way in which some of the crackdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood that we're seeing happening now are even more severe than the crackdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood that occurred under the Mubarak regime. That's very concerning.
Yeah.
That the Brotherhood was outlawed during certain portions of time under Mubarak, and obviously repression of opposition is one of the things that spurred democratic revolution in Egypt in the first place. But I think the hallmark of democracy is respect for the opposition. So when you call an opposition, when you call any political group in that country a terrorist group, and you have other groups that have claimed responsibility for the same acts that you're blaming that group for, then you have some concern. So if you don't have respect for opposition parties or multiple political parties, you don't have democracy. So I think the concern is that we're seeing even harsher and more widespread crackdowns against the Muslim Brotherhood than we saw even under Mubarak. That poses a lot of concerns. So then just to address in my final moments this question of military aid and how some of these examples that I've talked about impact U.S. aid policy, I hate to be perhaps a little bit depressing in my conclusions here, but I'm not sure that we'll see changes right now. Some of the concerns, and the U.S. has been concerned about the situation in Egypt in the past. The last time that this discussion was had about giving military aid, the language of national security interest was used to overcome opposition in the U.S. government towards dispensing this aid. I think we'll see the same thing happening. John Kerry has said that the army acted the way it did to save democracy. He has not labeled it a coup. The language of the State Department has been that the relationship between the U.S. and Egypt is an important relationship. They don't want to sever relations. Relations means money, right? They don't want to sever those. So I think that the policy that we will see is this sort of pushing the Egyptian government to reconsider the way that it conducts trials, but not necessarily halting of military aid. At the same time, it is not all hopeless. So what can we do about that? I think there are two main things that tend to change U.S. foreign policy. The first is public opinion. That can have a huge impact. So as individuals are, and everyone has sort of already discussed this, that there tends to be woeful lack of awareness of what's going on among average American citizens. So the more that that awareness can spread, the more likely it is that U.S. policy will change. And also, changing U.S. understandings of our own strategic interests is crucial to have a change in U.S. policy. So I've said that the U.S. operates privileging this idea that our national interest matters. The key then may be getting the U.S. to define its national interests with regard to Egypt in a way different than it has in the past. And part of that may be reconsidering the relationship between the U.S. and the Egyptian military in terms of the way that this perception often circulates, that the military necessarily speaks for the people of Egypt. So as that perception starts to change with more awareness of what's going on there with the crackdown, then I think we may see U.S. policy itself change. And that's the key to changing the way that aid is dispensed and that sort of thing. So I'll end there.
You were very kind, Dr. Octa. Let's really show our appreciation for that great presentation. Again, I'm very embarrassed to ask our other two panelists to keep their speeches on the short demands of a parliament member of Egypt, but anyway, we'll get to that in just a minute. Dr. Octa was mentioning so many things about John Kerry, and I remember when he found out about those 529 death sentences, he was so demoralized, he walked into a bar in Washington, and the bartender said, "Why the long face?" Get it, long face. Come on, I thought. And then I remember when Sadat was the president, Mubarak was the vice president, right? And he went to India to visit Indira Gandhi when she was alive, right? So after 3 days in India, he returned to Cairo. He told his staff, "Go in the street, find me a red dot. I want to put that red dot right here." And his staff said, "Usually the red dot is, for Hindus, and you're a Muslim, Arab guy. Why do you want the red dot?" He said, "Well, when Mrs. Gandhi was waving goodbye in the Delhi airport, she said, 'Mr. Mubarak, you're a great man. You've got a great future. But one problem, you've got nothing here.'" All right, just trying to lighten up the atmosphere. I'm hoping that Dr. Khalid will translate this for our friends in Egypt, because this conference has the potential to go far and wide to bring this cause in front of the larger world community. So Dr. Michelle Dierdorf will also give her presentation now, and I mentioned a couple of things about her, that she's also a professor in the poli-sci department here at UTC, and that she has a background in civil rights and human rights work. For 17 years, her organization down there in the Fannie Lou Hamer National Institute on Citizenship and Democracy, which is a coalition of academics who promote civic engagement and popular sovereignty through the study of the struggle for civil rights in the United States. This is very important information, and to have a person with her qualifications on this panel, we are very privileged and very happy to be here in UTC. It shows you some of the treasures of the academics we have, young people with a big future for our country. And so we ask Dr. Michelle to take her time for her speech right now. Thank you.
All I really would like to do is remind us of some lessons we've learned in the United States. It's easy for us to look at a democracy that's been in existence for a while and to forget that the public face we tell of ourselves and the public history we give often conceals a lot of our own violence and our own constraints that we've provided against our own citizens. And I think there's some lessons we have of ways in which people have resisted and challenged those restraints that may prove useful at this time. One of the things we've been, as the Hamer Institute, has been most concerned about is the fact that in a democracy, the people are the ones who are sovereign, right? We are the ones who govern. And when we don't take responsibility for it, when we abdicate those responsibilities, horrible things happen. And we have a history in the United States of those horrible things happening. The Southern Civil Rights Movement is one classic example of that, of the abuses and the violence that occurred for many years and continue to occur. But that's not the history we tell. We tell a very triumphant history of how wonderful everything is now and how horrible it was, and look, we solved the problem and we've moved on. And that's not necessarily the case. So there's two elements I'd like to talk about in terms of this. The first is that it's a history of resistance and struggle. It's a history of people challenging, disagreeing, fighting back, recognizing that the laws that are in place that often preclude due process, preclude equal protection, preclude the things we say are inherent for a democracy, require people to resist when those things are not provided. The second thing I think we have to remember is that violence and oppression is a way in which the state maintains its control. It can be done legally, it can be done illegally, but it's a constant part of that struggle. Today we see that struggle and the conflict between order and liberty, and I think we see this in most countries. Countries have a concern about the maintaining of order, making sure that there's stability, making sure that there's safety, but the question is, in a democracy, how do you do that in a way that still protects the liberty of the people? Do I remind you, part of the sovereignty of the democracy? And so what I would argue, again, very quickly, is that means there's a very high interest in the state protecting dissent and the right of people to dissent, because it's only through dissent and challenging to the state that change occurs and that the state is held accountable. So 2 quick points. One, this idea of this technique of making dissenters illegal and making them terrorists is a long-held one that many democracies have exercised. We saw that in the United States with the declaring of people who were in civil rights organizations, they became communists. And during the Cold War, that was no slight accusation, and it had long-term implications. We saw the destruction of community centers like churches and schools, and this still often happens in communities where there's challenges and dissents. Often the first threat by either a local terrorist organization, paramilitary organization, or the state police is schools and churches and the destruction of those. So church bombings often occur. Well, why? Because that's a place where local people gather, local people govern themselves, local people have autonomy. And so it becomes an easy and dangerous threat. The other thing is the role of state-sponsored violence. It is often done under the justification of order. And this form of oppression is a means of constructing fear. The age of lynching in the United States, which existed for about 75 years and is incredibly underreported and not studied, very often we make it look like it's this romantic Western notion of local folks taking care, of upholding their own order, when actually they tended to be mass lynchings. There are entire communities coming together, targeting individuals, with the goal of holding people in fear and convincing them not to challenge the system. We also saw the role of mob violence. We have lots of mob violence in the United States. And this is where individual communities were targeted, and authorities gave sanction for those communities to be destroyed. Again, long history of this. So, why am I saying all this? There are ways to end it. I am hopeful because I see a history of when local people, when communities come together, when communities challenge things, oppression cannot stand. So I wanted to keep this short because I think the Q&A becomes very important, but I want to end with the words of Frederick Douglass. And I think what he has to say, he said in the 1860s, is as important for all of us today as it was then. And he says this: "Those who profess to favor freedom, yet depreciate agitation, are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and never will."
Well, I'd like to take this moment and thank Dr. Dierdorf for that wonderful presentation. And our final speaker, before we get to a couple of the Q&As, is Dr. Abdul-Mahmoud Dardari on the far right. I could take his whole time in introducing him, but I won't let him.
No, please don't.
But I do want to say two quick bullet points just for your information. He's an elected member of the Egyptian Parliament, elected by the people, by the population, by tens of millions of people, imagine. And of course, he was chased out by the military coup. He delivered a letter for President Morsi to Nelson Mandela's family in the Republic of South Africa after he passed away. A letter of condolence to the Mandela family. And the same family refused to receive any of the Sisi government people down there with the same kind of letter, okay? That's one point. Then in Malaysia, he delivered a statement on behalf of Dr. Muhammad Al-Khattani, the Speaker of the House under the Morsi administration. He delivered a letter from him to the Speaker of the Parliament in to the Malaysian high officer there. And also, that high officer in Malaysia refused to meet with the Sisi people. So I think that's significant that this man is not only an elected member of Parliament, but he was doing his job properly, and to the and witnessed firsthand the rejection of the people who chased him out. So with that short introduction, we have Dr. Abdul-Mahmoud Dardari, PhD, Cultural Studies, Eurocentrism versus Islamism, University of Pittsburgh. I had no idea this brother was from the 412. When you're really cool in America, you refer to the city as the area code. Detroit, hey, how's the 313? Miami, what's going on in the 305? The brother man's from the 412, Pittsburgh.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the
American approach for democracy, for organizing such an important event. And I really hope that such important event can be emulated in many other campuses. And I believe what we saw today, what we heard today, so many Americans, once they hear what's happening, we will find them supporting freedom, democracy, and rule of law in Egypt. It is upon our responsibility as Egyptians to be able to go around, since we have the freedom to move, and Egyptian brothers and sisters in our country back home do not have that freedom. So let us make the best use of this. I would like also to thank the University of Tennessee here, and I'm really happy that distinguished faculty members of the political science department are participating in this, because it's very important that we engage together. Injustice somewhere is injustice anywhere. So the fact that it's not about Egypt, it's about human beings suffering in the prisons of a dictatorship, that we need really to work hard to bring it down. I really like the Frederick Douglass. When I was doing my PhD in the University of Pittsburgh, I loved the Frederick Douglass writing, and I really like the statement you said. And I also remember another statement by a great man, Malcolm X, who said, if you're not willing to sacrifice for freedom, you'd better drop that word from your own vocabulary. Such important things we need to learn. And it is really an invitation for us Egyptians to really work hard for freedom, justice, whatever it takes, by all means necessary. Again, Malcolm X. And one thing that we learned from the American history is give me liberty or give me death. I remember on the coup night, I was called by CNN, Christiana Mambour, in my hometown, Lux, and she interviewed me. She told me, what is the plan? The president is kidnapped. I told her we will do the same as what Americans did, give me liberty or give me death. So I do hope these are not really empty words. These are real life strategies that we as Egyptians, people from Bangladesh, people from Syria, people from so many different parts of the world need to learn that there is a price for freedom, and we have to be willing to pay this price. I usually have two hats, at least, one academician and one politician. I am an academician by profession, but politician by necessity, not by ambition. I never had the ambition to become a politician. I love academia. I consider the classroom setting is the most important democratic place on the face of the earth. And as an academician, I was teaching. After I got my PhD, I went to Egypt. I was teaching there, and I saw the suffering. I spent 15 years in America, and then I went to Egypt. I saw the suffering on all walks of life. Everywhere there is suffering in Egypt. Egypt, 50% of the country is under poverty line. 40% is illiterate. The health services are really in bad shape. The educational, we teach students to memorize things. At the end of the day, they just put what they memorize and they don't get critical education. I suffered a lot in my classes. What do? I believe in education that can change. I never believed in education just keeps the status quo. If education does not change people, I personally believe it is useless education. And here you go, I teach in the English department. What do I do? What do I teach people? Do I teach them Romeo and Juliet? Or I teach them Animal Farm? It's a choice. So I used to teach Animal Farm, an enemy of the people, plays and novels that will help the students to understand what's going on around them. Because I saw what the military regime did for 60 years. We suffered beyond imagination on all aspects. Poverty, bribery. You cannot do anything unless you pay money under the table in Egypt. It is terrible. People, there are people in Kerry. After the night comes, they go spend the night in the graveyards. It is that Egypt that we wanted to change. It is that Egypt when people go to the hospital to get the medication, you don't find doctors and they don't find medication. So they end up suffering. So many millions of Egyptians, and I think the Egyptian situation, we have 5% on the top of everything. They have it all. 15% is in service of the 5%. And the 5 and the 15 together try to control the 80%. And that's why the Egyptians decided to go to the streets. After 6 years of Nasser to Mubarak, we wanted our freedom. Ancient Egypt is known for The pyramids and the Sphinx. And I always said, now it is time for modern Egyptians to build the new pyramids of freedom and new Sphinx of justice. This is what we wanted. We were not against anyone. We were against the system, the corrupt system. That's why when we went to the streets, we demanded الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. The people demand the collapse of the system, the dismantling of the system. This is what we wanted. We were not against America. We were not against Saudi Arabia. We were not against anyone. We wanted to fix. That's why we had 4 principles of the revolution. And by the way, the Rab'a sign also can mean those 4 principles of the revolution. We wanted to have economic progress. We wanted to have our freedom. We wanted to have social justice. And we wanted to have human dignity. I can speak for hours about how we left everything. You know, there are people in Egypt who live on a daily basis less than $1 a day. Some even less than 50 cents a day. Some even don't find they're surviving by miracles. They go around. You can see children going to the dentist trying to find something to eat. It is that Egypt where there are billionaires. That's the freedom. I couldn't. Before I left Egypt, I was told to walk next to the wall. I spent 15 years here. I got my PhD. I went to Egypt. They told me, oh, they changed the slogan now. You don't walk next to the wall. You walk inside the wall. Or you walk under the wall. You can't walk in the center. You as Egyptian, we lost the honor of being Egyptian. We were mistreated inside the country and mistreated outside of the country. That's why we went together, all of us, into the streets to bring down the system, not to bring down Mubarak. Mubarak was just the head of the system. And what we did successfully, we did bring down the head, but the whole system remained there. And that was the challenge that came attacked us. It was the system that attacked the new democracy. The new democracy, in any democracy, you learn a lot. We do not have the culture of dialogue. We do not have the culture of consensus. We did not have the culture of democracy in Egypt. It is me or the highway. It is Mubarak or there is no way you can do anything. That is the culture we were brought up in. So we wanted to have a democracy that can function. We had 2 choices. To go through the revolutionary way, or the revolutionary mode, and bring lots of damages to the country. Or to go through the democratic gradual reform process. All political parties, including my party, the Freedom and Justice Party, prefer to go through the democratic gradual reform of the police, of the army, of the state institutions of all. I agree with Dr. Muhammad, there were mistakes. In a transition like this, if you don't make mistakes, there is something wrong. Because the challenge was tremendous. I remember a police officer. There was a problem in my hometown, and the family called the police officer, would you please come and help me? He said, no, I'm on vacation for 4 years until Morsi leaves. It is that type of institutions that we had. The military was working against Morsi. The judiciary was working. You know, the judiciary wanted to make a judicial coup against Morsi. After half a year, they wanted to come and declare, the judges wanted to claim that we did not count the numbers, right? And now it is not Morsi who was supposed to be elected, it was the other guy. And at that time, they would give a justification for the army to move in, to remove Morsi and bring the other one. It is to that extent. And what Morsi did, he made a presidential declaration so that he could stop the judiciary from moving against him. So it is that Egypt that we are talking about. So in that process towards democracy, I remember talking with Dr. Morsi and his position. The problem, excuse me, one major problem of Morsi, he was an ethical man in an unethical environment. The man believed in the rule of law. The man did not, because Morsi, by the way, during the revolution, he was put in prison. And he came out of prison, he became the president. In that, a logical human reaction is just to try to punish the people who punished you. And he was put in prison many times. And in spite of this, he said, no, it's not going to happen this way. We need a new Egypt. We need new Egypt for everyone to come and participate. We need an Egypt. There was not one single political prisoners in that year of mercy. And many people blame him for that. Many people said, oh, you should have put thousands. There are now about 23,000 prisoners in Egypt. He said, people are saying, if Morsi put 10,000 of those so-called liberals in jail, maybe he would have produced better alternative. Morsi refused to punish anyone without the due process. And is this Morsi's mistakes? Maybe some say yes it is. I personally don't think. I think it is better to make mistakes with fairness and justice rather than to make right things with injustice and tyranny. And I think this is what Morsi. While Egyptians were moving into the learning process, on June 30th, large number of Egyptians went to the streets. And I was happy because that is the democratic process. When people don't like something, they just protest in the streets. The problem, the real crime that happened in Egypt, it is not June 30th. It is July 3rd. When the army moved in and did 5 crimes, kidnapped the president, the first ever elected president, suspended the constitution that was approved by the Egyptian, regardless the numbers, regardless of anything. But that was a beginning. It could have been ratified in the coming election for the parliament. And then dissolved an elected parliament. A parliament that was elected by the people and it is killing thousands. First time in the history of modern Egypt, the largest massacre in the history of modern Egypt took place in Rabaa. About 42 massacres took place in 9 months. The number of people in jail, large of my colleagues, people elected by the people of Egypt, with 32 million people elected. And members of parliament are in jail. Why? I am a university professor as well. No less than 400 university professors are in jail. For what? And they got their PhD from all over the world. It is that Egypt. Now, the regime wanted to suffocate freedom. All TV channels were shut down that belonged to the opposition. There is no freedom of movement. You can't move from one place to another. People, and we're back to the old system, to Mubarak regime. So what do we do? Let me focus on the future. Through my travels to South Africa, to Malaysia, to many different parts of the world, I see serious determination in the hearts and minds of Egyptians. I just came 2 nights ago from Austria. I had a meeting with the Egyptian community there. Everywhere I go, I find Egyptians determined. No way we will go back to Mubarak's days. No way we will accept the military or the police state again. We're determined to have. Because either full freedom or no freedom. Either full democracy or no democracy. So I think Egyptians need to continue this and need to determine not to accept halfways. I'm really sad, to be honest with you, that Lady Ashton of the European Union is going to Egypt. For what? To meet a former defense minister. A former. He's not anymore a defense minister. Why should Lady Ashton put her hands on someone who killed the Egyptians? His hands are full of blood of Egyptians. What are we saying? Why is the American administration still supporting a regime like this? Why can America says, oh, we can't stop the aid? But you know where the aid goes? It goes to the military. That is not right. I came to be educated in this country. I learned a lot from this country. That the ideals of freedom, what President Barack Obama told us in Cairo when he visited us, is that democracy is the way to go. We believe them. But you see what President Obama is doing now? The sanctions that was suggested in the previous panel needs to be imposed on the Egyptian regime. The American administration needs to build a strategic, I like the idea of perception of what the strategic interests are. The perception of America is to build relationship with dictators. That is not going to happen. That will not be tolerated by the people of Egypt. When you kill us in the streets and you say you would like to build a friendship, that is not friendship. I was in the foreign ministry of Austria and I met the minister. The minister said, we're very much interested in cultural dialogue. I said, come on. You can't kill me and you say cultural dialogue. What dialogue is this? I think we are in a crossroad. I wrote my dissertation on the third alternative between Eurocentrism versus Islamism. The relationship between Europe and the Muslim world was always like this. Either Muslims attacking Europeans or Europeans attacking Muslims. I always dreamed of this relationship. Mutual understanding, mutual respect. Can it happen? It depends. Europe and the United States are on a crossroad. Now, if they keep supporting the coup, and if the coup gets institutionalized, because this seems what they're trying to do, is to push for an election so that it gives it false legitimacy. I think we're bringing this old formula back, and I don't think we will be able to develop bridges of understanding between them, because there are awareness now that it is not Sisi who is doing this, it is those who support Sisi. It is those who support Sisi with money, with diplomacy, with all whatever it takes. And I think Egyptians are more conscious now of what is going on. It is very important, and I think no Egyptian with clear conscience or clear mind would support a military regime or would support the military to be involved in politics. The military, we as Egyptians need to agree that the military has to be out of politics. Number two is the final decision. Those who give legitimacy to anyone is the people of Egypt. And then human rights, rule of law, issues of justice and fairness, social justice need to be kept in consideration. International pressure is important. The fact that we're meeting here at the University of Tennessee, respected university, is very important. We're sending a very important message that dictatorship, tyranny, injustice will not be accepted or tolerated. We need not to recognize the coup or any of its ramifications. Whatever they make constitution or election, this should not, because what is built on wrong will continue to be wrong. I think we can do a lot. I think the people of Egypt, I am very proud, and from here I send my congratulations to the students of Egypt. I am in a university campus, and students can always make a change. Look the role of the students in apartheid, look the role of the students in many, many activities. The students of Egypt now, hundreds of the students of Egypt are in jail. Hundreds of them are killed, but they're determined to continue all the way so that they can bring justice, democracy, and rule. There is no future for Egypt without democracy. Don't talk to me about economic progress if I am not a free human being. We're not animals. We don't care about, you feed us and you treat us as animals. It's not going to work anymore. We need to be treated and respected as human beings so that we can work together for economic progress. I am still optimistic. I am not pessimistic at all. And I think what happened, in spite of the evil things that took place and the massacres that took place, but I am very optimistic. What we've learned as Egyptians in the past 9 months, we could have spent 40 years without learning. We know now who is working for democracy. We know now who is working against democracy. The 5% cannot continue to control Egypt. The people of Egypt will have to have the final say, and those who support democracy worldwide can help a lot. Thank you.
This panel here you see up on the stage is a group of very important people, important thinkers. I want to say that I'm really grateful that I was asked to moderate this session. It's going to be on the website of the group, the Egyptians Abroad for Democracy Worldwide. We've had 3 questions about how do we get access to these things. That's one way, to go to their site, go to their Facebook page, because this whole conference is going to be online, right, Brother Osama? Yeah. And plus that good-looking brother there, Osama, I got in trouble the other day. The cops pulled me over and they looked through my phone and see I got Brother Osama, I know his home number, his car number, and so all of a sudden he scrolls down and he goes, Osama, sell. Oh no. Yeah, Osama, sell. So, okay, I want to thank the panel. I'm going to kind of override the request from the floor. We have 3 questions up here, but there's one question there for you, Doctor, right? Did you want to address that?
No, it's about the next panel. Yeah.
The next panel?
Yeah, that we should.
Yeah, in other words, we should vacate. Imagine that. We have a member of parliament here, 3 counting me. I have a PhD also, a professional hairdresser. So counting me, I have 5 PhDs up on the stage. I have to ask them to vacate. In 2 minutes, we're going to have our final panel.
No break. It's the no I received. that because of time constraints, we'll move straight on to the next panel.
Straight on. No break. Okay. If you don't mind, 45 seconds from now, we're going to have to. Let's have a round of applause.
Yeah.